She never questioned why her son's eyes didn't look like hers. Not until the day the hospital called. By then, Celeste Harmon had already given 11 years of her life to a version of the truth that had been carefully constructed by someone else. 11 years of school drop-offs and late-night fevers and parent-teacher conferences attended alone. 11 years of explaining, in the polite and practiced way that single mothers learn to explain things, that her son's father was not in the picture the way she had once hoped he would be. She had never blamed herself for that. She had blamed the circumstances, the incompatibility, the distance, the slow erosion of something that had once felt certain. What she had never once allowed herself to consider was that there had been no circumstances. There had only been a lie, told to her face, in the 3rd month of a relationship, by a man who already knew exactly what he was doing. The man's name was Glenn Packard. He was 41 years old, well-dressed, and spoke in the measured tones of someone who had spent years learning how to be believed. He met Celeste at a charity gala in Charlotte, North Carolina, in the fall of 2011. He told her he worked in commercial real estate. He told her he had been married once, briefly, in his early 30s, and that it had ended amicably. He told her, before the end of their 2nd month together, that he was infertile, that a specialist had confirmed it years earlier and that it was something he had quietly made peace with. He said it with the particular kind of sadness that invites comfort rather than questions. Celeste, who was 34 years old and had spent her 20s focused almost entirely on her career as a hospital administrator, had not been looking for a reason to distrust him. She had been looking for a reason to stay. He gave her one. Glenn did not offer documentation the way some men in his position might have. He did not need to. What he offered was something more effective, a consistent, unhurried story told across weeks and months, layered into the fabric of ordinary conversation until it became simply part of who he was. He mentioned the infertility the way a person mentions an old injury or a childhood loss, as context, not as confession. He integrated it into discussions about the future with such naturalness that Celeste found herself moving past it rather than examining it. By the time they had been together for 6 months, it felt less like a disclosure and more like a known fact, the way a person's height or their relationship with their family becomes a known fact, something you have absorbed so thoroughly you no longer think to question it. When Celeste discovered she was pregnant in the spring of 2012, she was alone in the apartment she had lived in for 4 years, on a Tuesday morning, before work. She sat on the edge of her bathtub for a long time before she moved. The feeling she described later was not panic, exactly, and not joy, exactly, it was something closer to vertigo, the particular disorientation of having a reality you understood suddenly prove itself flexible. She was pregnant by a man who had told her he could not make her pregnant. She ran the timeline in her mind 3 times. There was no other explanation. She had been faithful. She had been careful about everything except the one thing she believed required no care at all. She called Glenn from the parking lot of her office building that afternoon and told him before she had fully decided to. His silence on the phone lasted 4 seconds. She counted them without knowing why. When Glenn spoke, he said the doctors must have been wrong. He said stranger things had happened. He said he loved her, and that they would figure it out together, and that this was not a bad thing, it was an unexpected thing, which was different. Celeste listened to all of this and felt something loosen inside her, the tension she had been holding since the morning releasing in a way that felt like relief. She told herself that she had been right to trust him. She told herself that the 4 seconds of silence had been surprise, nothing more. She told herself the story Glenn was telling, and she would go on telling it to herself for a long time afterward. Because the alternative, that she had been deceived at the most fundamental level by someone she had chosen to love, was not something her mind was yet able to hold. The pregnancy was not easy. Celeste developed complications in her 2nd trimester that required 2 separate hospitalizations and a month of reduced activity that nearly cost her the promotion she had spent 3 years working toward. Glenn visited. He brought things, food, books, a small succulent he placed on her nightstand that she would keep alive for years after he was gone, without fully understanding why. He was present in the way that made her feel, during those long weeks in and out of the hospital, that she had chosen correctly. He sat beside her bed and talked about the future with a specificity that felt like commitment. He said the baby's name, whichever name they landed on, out loud in the hospital room. He seemed, to every observer and to Celeste herself, like a man preparing to be a father. He was not. He was a man managing a situation. And he had, by then, a great deal of experience with that. Celeste's son was born on a November evening, healthy, loud, and possessed, from the very first hour, of a quality of alertness that the nurses commented on. She named him Daniel. Glenn was in the delivery room. He held Daniel for several minutes after the birth, long enough that Celeste, watching from the bed, felt something settle inside her that had been unsettled for months. She thought, this is going to be all right. She thought it genuinely, without reservation, in the way that exhausted and newly delivered mothers sometimes make declarations to themselves that feel, in the moment, entirely true. Glenn looked down at the boy in his arms with an expression she would spend years trying to decode, not coldness, not tenderness, but something that existed between the two with the careful neutrality of a man who has decided to feel nothing in particular. Glenn stayed for 3 days after Daniel came home from the hospital. Then he said he had to return to a project in Raleigh that had fallen behind while he was away. He said he would be back the following weekend. He was. And the weekend after that, and the one after that, for a while. But the visits grew shorter and the gaps between them grew longer in a way that Celeste recognized as a pattern before she was willing to name it. She had seen this shape before, in other relationships, in other people's lives. She had simply never imagined being inside it. By the time Daniel was 18 months old, Glenn was visiting once or twice a month. By the time Daniel was 3, the visits had become phone calls. By the time Daniel was 4, even the phone calls had acquired a quality of obligation rather than desire, brief, pleasant, and leaving Celeste with the particular emptiness of a conversation that communicated nothing real. She did not go to court to establish child support for 3 years. This was not passivity, it was calculation. She had an income, a career that had recovered and then exceeded what she had hoped for before Daniel was born, and a pride that made asking for help feel, at the time, like a kind of defeat. When she finally did file, the process was straightforward and the outcome, financially, was adequate. Glenn cooperated without resistance. He paid on time. He called Daniel on birthdays and holidays in a pattern that was reliable enough to be considered present and sporadic enough to be considered absent, depending on the week. Daniel grew up knowing his father's voice and face without knowing him, which is a particular kind of knowing that carries its own grief, a grief Celeste watched her son carry quietly, the way children carry things they do not yet have language for. Celeste raised Daniel the way she did most things, with efficiency and intention and a stubbornness that people in her life sometimes mistook for ease. She was not finding it easy. She was finding it necessary, which is a different thing, and she had learned early in her life not to wait for easy before doing what was necessary. She had a network, her mother in Columbia, South Carolina, who drove up on alternate weekends, a neighbor named Vivian who had raised 3 children of her own and could be called at unreasonable hours without complaint, 2 close friends from college who showed up, reliably, when showing up was required. She was not alone in the way that the word alone sometimes implies total isolation. But she was singular in the way that mattered most. There was only one person who woke up every morning responsible for Daniel, and that person was her. Daniel was a gentle child, curious and careful, the kind of boy who collected questions the way other children collected things. He wanted to know why the sky was the color it was and whether fish could dream and what happened to thoughts after you stopped thinking them. Celeste answered as many as she could and told him honestly when she didn't know, because she had decided early that honesty was the thing she owed him above almost everything else. She read to him every night until he was old enough to read to himself, and then she read beside him, which is its own kind of reading. She attended every school event and drove him to every practice and sat in the bleachers of soccer fields in all kinds of weather, alone, with a thermos of coffee, watching her son learn how to be in the world. She did all of this without complaint and without particular credit, the way millions of mothers do, because that is what the work requires. The years between Daniel's 5th birthday and his 11th passed in a compressed, particular way that years passed during childhood, slowly when lived and quickly when remembered. Celeste was promoted twice. She bought the apartment she had been renting. She dated, carefully and briefly, twice, both times ending things before they became complicated enough to involve Daniel, not because she was protecting herself but because she was protecting him, and the line between those two things was one she had long ago stopped trying to draw clearly. Glenn drifted further and further toward the edge of their lives, present enough to remain a figure in Daniel's understanding of himself, absent enough that the figure was largely abstract. Daniel asked about his father less as he grew older, not because his curiosity had diminished but because he had learned, in the sensitive and perceptive way of children who grow up in incomplete households, that certain questions caused his mother a quiet pain that she tried not to show and that he tried not to cause. It was a school project that started it. Daniel was 11 years old, in the 6th grade, and his science class had been assigned a unit on heredity, the kind of introductory genetics lesson that covers eye color and blood types and the basic mechanics of inheritance. Daniel was thorough about his schoolwork in the way that Celeste had always been thorough about hers, and he came home one evening with a worksheet that asked him to chart the eye colors of both biological parents alongside his own. Celeste's eyes were brown. Glenn's, as far as she had always understood, were hazel, a warm, yellowish green. Daniel's eyes were gray. Not blue-gray, not gray-green, but a clear, flat gray that Celeste had always assumed was simply a recessive variation of something in the family line she hadn't traced carefully enough. The worksheet did not alarm her. What it did was prompt her, for the first time in years, to look carefully at a thing she had grown accustomed to not looking at. She sat across from Daniel at the kitchen table while he filled in the chart, and she looked at his face with the particular attention of a woman who had spent 11 years looking at it and had somehow stopped seeing it clearly. He had Glenn's jawline, she had always thought so. But the forehead, the slightly wide-set placement of his eyes, the shape of his nose, these were not Glenn's features. They were not hers either. They belonged to a face she could not place, and the impossibility of placing them produced, in Celeste's chest, a sensation she would later describe as the first crack in a wall she had not known she was standing behind. She did not act on it immediately. This is important to understand, not as a criticism but as a reflection of what it actually means to suspect something that would, if confirmed, dismantle the narrative of your own life. Celeste went back to work the next morning and the morning after that. She made Daniel's lunches and attended a budget meeting and called her mother on Sunday and did not mention the feeling in her chest to anyone. But she also, quietly and without telling herself she was doing it, began to notice things she had been not noticing for years. The shape of Daniel's hands. The way he laughed. The particular quality of his attention when he was interested in something, that focused, slightly tilted stillness that did not resemble anything in Celeste's family and had never, she now realized, resembled anything in Glenn's either. Celeste ordered the DNA test on a Wednesday. She told herself she was doing it for medical reasons, for Daniel's records, for completeness, and this was not entirely untrue. But she also knew, in the part of herself that she trusted most, that she was doing it because the question had been living inside her for weeks and had grown too large to ignore. The kit was the kind available at any pharmacy, discreet and straightforward, and Daniel submitted his sample without particular interest, understanding only that his mother was updating some paperwork. Celeste submitted Glenn's sample using material she had retained from a legal process years earlier, a process that had required his documentation and had, at the time, produced a file she had kept without knowing why. The results came back in 12 days. Celeste opened the email on a Thursday evening, after Daniel had gone to bed. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, and the apartment was quiet in the way that apartments are quiet after a child has fallen asleep, a particular, charged silence that feels both peaceful and fragile. She read the results twice. Then she set her phone face down on the table and sat with her hands flat against the surface and breathed. Glenn Packard was not Daniel's biological father. The probability indicated by the test was not a percentage that left room for interpretation. It was a number that meant, no. Completely, categorically, no. For a long time, she did not move. The tea was cold. The apartment was quiet. 11 years of her life rearranged themselves in her mind like furniture being moved in a room, the same objects, but different positions, different shadows, different shapes made by the spaces between them. The infertility. The 4-second silence on the phone. The way Glenn had held Daniel in the delivery room, that careful, neutral expression she had spent years trying to decode. She could decode it now. It was the expression of a man who had known, from the moment he was handed that baby, that what he was holding was proof of something, proof that Celeste had been faithful, that the child was not his, and that the lie he had told at the beginning of their relationship had served its purpose and was no longer necessary to maintain. He had known. For 11 years, he had known and said nothing. If this story is holding you, stay with it. What Glenn Packard did to Celeste did not end with one woman, and what happened next changed everything. Before we continue, if you are watching on YouTube, take a second right now and subscribe to Hidden Intent Stories. Every week we bring you stories like this one, real in every way that matters. Hit the bell so you never miss one. Now. Back to Celeste. Celeste did not call Glenn that night. She understood, with the clear-eyed practicality of someone who processes shock by becoming very still and very methodical, that the conversation she needed to have with him required preparation. She called her mother instead. Her mother, a retired schoolteacher named Evelyn who had raised Celeste alone after her own husband left when Celeste was 7, and who had spent decades developing the particular composure of a woman who has survived things, listened to everything without speaking. When Celeste finished, Evelyn said 3 words. She said, "Get a lawyer." Not because lawyers solve everything, but because some situations require the right kind of witness, and Evelyn Harmon had lived long enough to know which situations those were. The lawyer's name was Sandra Voss, a family law attorney in Charlotte with a reputation for precision and an office filled with the quiet hum of a woman who had heard most things and been surprised by very few of them. Celeste sat across from her desk and told the story from the beginning, the gala, the infertility disclosure, the pregnancy, the 11 years, the DNA test, in the same order and the same tone she would have used presenting a budget analysis at work. Sandra listened. She asked questions about documentation. Had Glenn ever put the infertility claim in writing? Were there text messages, emails, anything that could be traced? There were not, in the formal sense. But there was something else. There were several women who had left reviews on a couples therapy platform, a site that matched clients to therapists, in which they described, in the anonymous and fractured way of people processing something privately, relationships with a man who had told them he was infertile. The reviews were years old. They were not connected to Glenn by name. But Celeste, reading them on a Saturday afternoon in her own apartment, recognized the shape of what they described the way you recognize a house you once lived in by the arrangement of the windows. Finding the other women took 4 months. Sandra Voss did not do this work herself. She connected Celeste with a private investigator named Tom Arbor, a former county detective who specialized in domestic cases and communicated in the kind of flat, factual sentences that Celeste found, during this period, enormously steadying. Tom's work was patient and methodical. He started with the reviews and worked outward from there, cross-referencing dating histories and mutual connections and the particular geography of Glenn's professional network in ways that Celeste did not fully understand but trusted completely. By the time his preliminary report arrived, Tom had identified 3 women who had been in relationships with Glenn Packard across a period of 14 years and who had, in each case, been told the same thing about his fertility in the early stages of their relationship. Of the 3, 2 agreed to speak with Sandra Voss's office. The first was a woman named Roberta Lane, who had dated Glenn for 14 months in 2007 and had ended the relationship without ever becoming pregnant, but who had made specific decisions about her own reproductive future based on what she understood to be his inability to father children. Those decisions, made in the mid-30s, in the limited time window that fertility often represents, had consequences she was still living with. The second was a woman named Claudia Marsh, who had become pregnant during a 9-month relationship with Glenn in 2009, had been told by him that the pregnancy was medically impossible if he was the father, and had spent 3 years in a state of confusion and self-doubt before eventually ending the relationship and, eventually, the pregnancy, having been convinced by Glenn's certainty that something was not adding up about her own account of events. Claudia's voice, in her initial phone call with Sandra's paralegal, was very quiet and very even, in the way of someone who has spent a long time arriving at a composure they are not certain will hold. Glenn was confronted with the DNA results and the accounts of the other women through Sandra Voss's office rather than directly by Celeste. This was Sandra's recommendation and Celeste followed it, not because she was afraid of him, she was not, but because Sandra had explained that direct confrontation at this stage would give Glenn time to construct a response rather than simply have to give one. The letter sent by Sandra's office was specific and documented. It outlined the DNA findings, summarized the pattern of behavior identified across multiple relationships, and noted the existence of witnesses. It asked for a response within 10 business days. Glenn's response came in 8. It was delivered through his own attorney, a man named Harris from a firm in Raleigh that specialized in civil defense, and it was carefully worded in a way that admitted nothing while contesting everything. It suggested that the infertility information had been shared in good faith based on a diagnosis Glenn had received years earlier and that subsequent fertility could not have been predicted. It characterized the other women's accounts as anecdotal and unverifiable. It argued that any harm Celeste had experienced was the result of her own assumptions rather than any deliberate misrepresentation. Reading it, Celeste felt not anger but a kind of cold and clarifying recognition. This was who Glenn was. Not the man who had stood beside her hospital bed with a succulent plant and a voice full of specificity about the future. This, the letter written by a lawyer designed to ensure accountability landed nowhere, was the actual architecture of him. The civil case filed by Sandra Voss on Celeste's behalf argued fraudulent misrepresentation, that Glenn had knowingly conveyed false information about a material fact in order to obtain and maintain a relationship, resulting in documented harm. The harm was substantial. Celeste had made career decisions, financial decisions, and reproductive decisions inside the frame of a relationship that had been constructed on a lie. She had raised a child without the co-parent she had been led to believe existed. She had absorbed, over 11 years, the full financial and emotional cost of a situation that had been manufactured by someone else's deception. Sandra Voss made this argument to the court with the methodical exactness of someone who had spent 20 years learning to translate human damage into language a legal system could weigh. The judge listened carefully. The case was not dismissed. What happened in the months that followed was not swift. Legal proceedings rarely are, and Celeste had grown, by this point, into a woman with a specific talent for endurance. She had work. She had Daniel. She had her mother and Vivian next door and the 2 college friends who continued to show up when showing up was required. She moved through the process the way she moved through most things, steadily, without drama, with the deep and private knowledge that she had been doing hard things alone for long enough that hard things no longer had the power to define her. The depositions were difficult. Glenn's attorney was precise and unpleasant in the way that certain attorneys are trained to be, and the questions were designed to make Celeste doubt the reliability of her own memory. She did not doubt it. She had lived it. The deposition that shifted the case was not Celeste's. It was Claudia Marsh's. Claudia, who had spent years being careful and even voiced about what had happened to her, sat across a conference table and answered questions for 3.5 hours with a clarity and a specificity that Sandra Voss described, afterward, as the most complete account of deliberate reproductive coercion she had encountered in 2 decades of family law practice. Claudia remembered everything, dates, words, the exact phrasing Glenn had used when she told him she was pregnant and he told her it was impossible, the way his voice had sounded, the 3-day silence before he reappeared with a theory about a mistake at the clinic. She had remembered it for 15 years. She had been waiting, in whatever form waiting takes when you don't know you're waiting, for somewhere useful to put it. The court found in Celeste's favor. The judgment was sufficient to cover legal fees, to cover the documented financial impact of 11 years of sole income parenting, and to represent, in the language available to civil courts, an acknowledgement that what had been done to Celeste Harmon was real and that it had consequences. Glenn appealed. The appeal was denied 8 months later. By the time the final judgment was executed, Celeste had already moved on to the next thing, not because justice had been served in any way that fully matched the shape of what she had lost, but because she had learned, long before any of this, that waiting for the world to catch up to what had happened to you was not the same as living. Telling Daniel was the thing Celeste had thought about the longest and prepared for the most carefully. She had been seeing a family therapist for 7 months by the time the legal process concluded, and she had spent those sessions understanding how to give her son information that would change his understanding of himself without damaging the foundation of who he already was. She told him on a Sunday afternoon in March, in the living room of the apartment he had grown up in. She used clear, simple language. She told him that Glenn was not his biological father, that she had not known this for most of his life, that she had found out and had gone through a process to understand what it meant, and that none of what she was telling him changed anything about who he was or how he had come into the world. Daniel listened. He was 12 years old. He asked 2 questions. The first was whether Glenn had known. The second was whether Celeste was okay. The biological father, a man named Roy Atkins, who had dated Celeste briefly in the summer of 2011, before she met Glenn, and who had moved to Portland, Oregon, and built a life there that included a job in environmental consulting and a home near the river, was located through the same investigative process that had uncovered the other women. He was contacted through Sandra's office. He had not known Celeste was pregnant. He had not known, for 12 years, that he had a son. He sat with the information for a week before responding. When he did respond, his message was short and handwritten and sent by post rather than email, which was the kind of detail that told Celeste something about the kind of person he was before she had ever met him. Roy flew to Charlotte that spring. He and Celeste met first, without Daniel, at a coffee shop near her office, 2 adults in their mid-40s sitting across from each other in the particular careful formality of people who share something enormous and have just met. He was quieter than she expected and more direct, and he asked questions about Daniel the way a person asks about someone they are already trying to understand rather than simply learn about. He asked what Daniel liked. He asked what he was good at. He asked what worried him. Celeste answered all of them and watched Roy Atkins's face across the table, and she thought, carefully, without rushing to a conclusion, that whatever had brought this man into her son's life through such a fractured and difficult path, he was not someone she needed to be afraid of. The first meeting between Roy and Daniel took place on a Saturday in April, in the same apartment where Celeste had raised him. Roy brought nothing, no gift, no prop, nothing designed to make the meeting easier than it was. He sat on the sofa and Daniel sat across from him and they talked, haltingly at first and then with increasing ease, about the things 12-year-old boys talk about when they are trying to decide whether to trust someone new. Roy had been a distance runner in his 20s. Daniel had recently joined his school's cross-country team. This was not a revelation. It was a small, quiet convergence, the kind that means something because it was not arranged. Daniel went to bed that night and did not say much about the visit, but Celeste heard him laughing, twice, from the hallway, a specific laugh she recognized as the one he used when something surprised him in a way he had not known to hope for. Roy had requested a transfer within his firm 4 months after meeting Daniel. The Portland office had treated him well and he had built a good life there, but it was a life built in the absence of information he now had, and he was not a man who ignored information once he had it. The Charlotte office of his environmental consulting firm was smaller but growing, and his director approved the transfer without resistance. Roy did not tell Celeste he was moving until the paperwork was finalized. He told her on a Tuesday evening, on the phone, in the same plain and direct way he communicated everything. He said he was not moving because he expected anything from her. He said he was moving because his son lived in Charlotte, and that was reason enough. Celeste held the phone against her ear for a moment after he finished speaking and did not say anything right away. Then she said, "Daniel is going to want to help you find an apartment." Roy said he was counting on it. The apartment Roy found was 12 minutes from Celeste's house, close enough to be present, far enough to make no assumptions. Daniel spent his first weekend there helping Roy assemble furniture and arguing about where the sofa should face, and he came home Sunday evening with sawdust on his jeans and an opinion about Roy's taste in rugs that he shared at dinner with the unsolicited confidence of someone who now had 2 households to critique. Celeste listened and asked questions, and that night, after Daniel had gone to bed, she sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea and allowed herself to feel something she had been careful not to feel too quickly. She felt hopeful. Not the fragile, provisional hope of someone who has been hurt and is trying again despite themselves. The steadier kind. The kind that comes when the evidence is actually there. Roy and Celeste did not rush. This was a mutual and unspoken understanding, 2 people in their mid-40s who had both learned, through different kinds of difficulty, that the things worth building are not built quickly. They had dinner twice a month, then once a week, then in the ordinary and unremarkable way of people whose lives have begun to overlap, they simply started spending time together without scheduling it. He came to Daniel's cross-country meets and stood on the other side of the course from Celeste so Daniel could see both of them when he finished. He and Evelyn developed a friendship rooted in their shared commitment to giving Celeste opinions she had not requested. He learned which grocery store Celeste preferred and which coffee she drank, and that she needed 20 minutes alone when she came home from work before she was ready to talk to anyone, and he gave her that 20 minutes without it ever needing to be discussed. By the time Daniel was 14, Roy had become the kind of presence in their lives that is hardest to describe because it does not have the drama of an arrival, it simply is. He was the person Daniel called when he had a question he didn't want to bring to his mother. He was the person Celeste texted when something at work made her laugh. He fixed a leak under her kitchen sink on a Saturday morning and stayed for lunch, and they sat at the table afterward with the comfortable silence of people who have stopped needing to fill every space. Celeste thought, this is what it was supposed to feel like. Not the version Glenn Packard had constructed, the careful, managed performance of a man assembling a domestic life for reasons that had nothing to do with love. This. The real thing. Ordinary and quiet and entirely without pretense. Roy proposed on a Sunday evening in April, in Celeste's backyard, while Daniel's vegetable garden was in its second and considerably more successful season. He did not make it an occasion. He did not arrange anything. He simply said, while they were sitting outside in the early spring warmth, that he wanted to marry her, that he had wanted to for a while and had been waiting until it felt like the right moment, and that he had recently concluded that waiting for the right moment was the kind of thing people did when they were uncertain, and that he was not uncertain. Celeste looked at him for a long moment. Then she said yes, in the same plain and direct way he said everything, because she had learned from him that plainness, in the right context, was not a lack of feeling. It was the purest form of it. Daniel found out at dinner that same evening. Roy told him, Celeste had insisted on that Roy be the one to say it. Daniel listened to the entire explanation with the careful, slightly tilted stillness that was his most considered response to important things. Then he asked if he could be involved in the planning. Then he asked if they were going to move into the same house. Then he asked, with the perfect practicality of a 14-year-old boy, whether Roy was going to get rid of the rug in his apartment that Daniel had told him twice was the wrong color. Roy said he would consider it. Daniel said that was not a yes. Roy said that was correct. Daniel looked at his mother with an expression that communicated both exasperation and contentment in equal measure, and Celeste looked back at her son, this person she had built a life around, who had gray eyes that belonged to the man now sitting at her kitchen table, and she felt the particular fullness of a moment that contains everything you were trying to get to when you didn't yet know where you were going. They married the following October, a small ceremony, immediate family only, in the backyard where Roy had proposed. Evelyn cried. Vivian next door leaned over the fence to watch and was invited to stay, which she did, without hesitation. Daniel stood beside Roy during the ceremony, not as a symbolic gesture but simply as himself, a boy who had decided, in his own time and on his own terms, that this man was someone he was glad to have. Celeste wore a dress she had found on a Saturday afternoon with her mother, and she looked, in every photograph from that day, like a woman who had arrived somewhere she recognized. Not because the road had been easy. Because she had walked it honestly, all the way to the end, and the end had turned out to be this: a backyard in October, the right people in the chairs, a life that was finally, completely, entirely her own. Glenn Packard was not present. He was not thought of. He had taken enough of her time, and she had decided, long before that October afternoon, that he would not take one more minute of it than she had already given. There are people who build their lives on the false stories they tell others, and for a while, the world lets them. But truth has a weight that manufactured versions of it cannot hold indefinitely. It surfaces. Through a worksheet, through a blood test, through a phone call from a hospital on an ordinary afternoon. It surfaces, and when it does not just expose the lie. It frees the people who had been living inside it. Celeste Harmon had spent 11 years inside someone else's lie. She spent the rest of her life in the truth, and the truth, it turned out, was more than enough. It was a husband who fixed leaks and showed up on time and gave her 20 minutes of quiet. It was a son with gray eyes who ran cross-country and argued about rugs and asked, when it mattered most, whether his mother was okay. It was a backyard in October, and a ceremony with no empty chairs, and a life that had been worth every difficult mile it took to reach it. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. There are people carrying versions of what Celeste carried, believing they are alone in it. Sometimes a story is the thing that reminds them they are not. Subscribe to Hidden Intent Stories and hit the bell. We bring you a new story every week. Leave a comment below and tell us, what part of Celeste and Roy's story stayed with you the most. We read every single one. And we will see you in the next story.